Good evening. My name is Isabelle Teare with the WTJX NewsFeed, and this is Trial Watch. Today was the fifth day of the case, the United States of America versus Ray Martinez and Jenifer O'Neill. Now, anyone who's been following, yesterday we left off with the testimony of Charlie Irons. He is, the general manager for Yacht Haven Grand. And today we started the day with the United States introducing their next witness. Now, before we go into that, a quick observation today. There was a new person in court today sitting in the gallery with those there to support Jenifer O'Neill. And this person was Jafari Daniel. That's Jenifer O'Neill's son. And he's the person whose name has actually come up a lot throughout this trial. He was a former employee for Monethos, and we've also seen his credit card statements in the trial as exhibits, because his credit card was used to purchase certain things for David Whitaker involving those trips to Boston that David Whitaker said he then reimbursed Jafari Daniel for. Okay, so let's get into this next witness. The United States called someone named Kiernan Whitworth. And Kiernan Whitworth is an FBI special agent. He has been for 11 years, and he is the case agent for this case. He was also the case agent that testified in the Calvert White Benjamin Hendricks case, for anyone who followed that. The direct examination of Agent Whitworth was done by Charisse Amaro. And she asked him just a little bit about his FBI training. Part of his answer, he explained that he was trained in source handling, trained on identifying sources, how to conduct interviews, how to verify source information, that kind of thing. So then Amaro asked him how he first learned about David Whitaker. And Agent Whitworth said that he first learned of David Whitaker when he transferred to St. Thomas from the FBI Charlotte, North Carolina office. And he learned about him because when he got to St. Thomas, there was an open case file about listening devices that had been discovered in government offices. So he took over that case and started reviewing and researching the case file, and that the file included reports from a company called Monethos and from David Whitaker about these devices, and that those reports showed the devices that were found were actually available for purchase on Amazon. Now, Agent Whitworth said that the FBI was already a little suspicious of David Whitaker at this point, so they did submit a subpoena to Amazon for David Whitaker's Amazon purchase history. And this showed that Whitaker had purchased the same devices that were found in these government offices. Amaro then asked, once they learned about this, what were their next steps? Agent Whitworth, I'm sorry about that. The names are similar. Agent Whitworth testified that they then pulled bank records, telephone records, and that kind of thing for David Whitaker, and that they found suspicious transactions. Amaro then asked, what were some of these transactions that raised concerns? Agent Whitworth said that he saw payments to the Virgin Islands Police Commissioner's wife. This is Diana Martinez. And that they also saw payments to Jafari Daniel, the director of OMB's son. So that this was concerning and maybe raised some flags. Whitworth also testified that in September of 2023, the FBI did their first, approach of David Whitaker, where they approached him with a search warrant for his cell phone, at which point they also showed him the transactions to Ray Martinez's wife, and that Whitaker then confessed. Amaro then asked the special agent about whether or not cooperating witnesses were frequently utilized by the FBI. Agent Whitworth said yes, they were, that cooperating witnesses were especially effective, but that the FBI did monitor all of the activity of these cooperating witnesses. He said that the FBI didn't, just trust these people right off the bat, that they always had to go and make sure to corroborate the information they were getting. Um, Amaro then asked him if the FBI allows witnesses to engage in criminal activity as part of the investigation. Agent Whitworth said yes, but that these cooperating witnesses have to enter into very certain specific agreements, and that their ability to, be a part of certain criminal activity is very narrowly scoped, he said. He gave the example that they couldn't just, go buy guns illegally or steal a car, that they had to follow instructions. Agent Whitworth said that in order to monitor David Whitaker, they monitored his cell phone, his physical movements. They monitored his physical movements even without his knowledge. He said they also monitored his financial accounts and travel and things like that. Then Amaro asked the special agent about what a consensual wiretap was. This is what they did to David Whitaker's phone. And the special agent explained that it's when a witness will agree to have a cell phone their cell phone company, perform a wiretap so that they can record all incoming and outgoing calls and also text messages. Amaro then asked if some of the recordings that David Whitaker got were not over the phone. And Agent Whitworth said yes. In those cases, when they weren't, the wiretapped conversations, the FBI did give David Whitaker certain FBI proprietary tools like recorders. Then Amaro asked if the FBI makes promises to cooperating witnesses. And Agent Whitworth said, no, the FBI didn't have that authority. Only the court had that authority. Amaro then asked if in September of 2023, did the FBI give David Whitaker directions? And Agent Whitworth said that the FBI had evidence at that point, and that David Whitaker had admitted to bribery of Martinez. So their instructions were really just for David Whitaker to, continue communications as usual. Then Agent Whitworth went and testified to several exhibits that were brought up on the screen. I'm not going to go into too much detail about these because these are things that we've already seen. Basically, these are like receipts for the JetBlue travel. And so we saw the receipts from JetBlue for the 3 trips. Amaro asked Agent Whitworth who paid for those. He said David Whitaker did. And then she also asked, was the FBI able to determine that these trips had nothing to do with government or Virgin Islands Police Department business? And Agent Whitworth said, yes, they were able to confirm that. Now, a quick observation. During his testimony, Agent Whitworth, he comes across as very confident on the stand. And what he would do is he would look at the prosecutor, Charisse Amaro, asking those questions. He would say maybe yes or no, but then he would look at the jury when he really started explaining and going into more detail. We then saw more exhibits introduced and Agent Whitworth testifying to certain certain records we saw about the payment that the United States says was, for rent for Ray Martinez's house. That's the $11,500 transaction, as well as those transactions showing that Monethos and David Whitaker sent money to Diana Martinez for private school tuition. So we ran through all of those. And then Charisse Amaro asked him, how did Jenifer O'Neill come to your attention? And Agent Whitworth said that they already knew who Jenifer O'Neill was simply because she was a high-ranking member of the Virgin Islands government, but that they did intercept recordings where Ray Martinez identified Jenifer O'Neill as someone who he wanted to give money to. Whitworth then said that the FBI's instructions to David Whitaker at this point were to just record those interactions. He said, that they told him to sit back and let the scheme play out. He said that throughout this, The FBI intercepted recordings of phone calls, text messages, also in-person meetings, and that they still had that wiretap on David Whitaker's cell phone. So they were recording all of these conversations. And this is what we've been seeing and hearing in court. We then saw a text message introduced as an exhibit. This is something that we've already seen. It's the text where Whitaker texts Jenifer O'Neill asking if the $216,000 Virgin Islands Police Department invoice has been processed. He says, Ray may never speak to us again if we leave before he gets the $70K for his food shop, especially if I tell him we're going to Encore and a game. Encore is that hotel in Boston. Jenifer O'Neill responds, LOL, I'll check with my staff. Now, Agent Whitworth said that at this point, Ray Martinez, had asked for $70,000 to be added as a separate line item to the invoice. And then Charisse Amaro asked, at this point in your investigation, what was your understanding of Jenifer O'Neill's, understanding of all of this? At which point Jenifer O'Neill's counsel, Dale Lionel Smith, objected. But Agent Whitworth then did respond, and he said at this point in their investigation, it was his understanding that O'Neill knew that $70,000 added to the invoice was for Ray Martinez's restaurant. And he said that she even contacted her staff about getting it processed. Then the Dale Lionel Smith, O'Neill's attorney, objected again, but the judge overruled it. And then there was a text message introduced into evidence. This is something that I don't believe I've read out before, so I'm going to read it in its entirety. This was a text on January 20th of 2024 between Jenifer O'Neill and someone named Jamie Gaston. We're going to hear testimony from her later, actually. She's an employee for the Office of Management and Budget. So this text message reads from Jenifer O'Neill, good afternoon. If you guys have ARPA payments pending to be processed, please get them entered so they can make Tuesday's check run. Please also follow up with DOF on premium pay and anything else ARPA related. I would like to keep my word and say with certainty that all of those are completed and we have no ARPA invoices we're sitting on. In that text message, DOF, she was referring to the Department of Finance. Then we saw another text message exchange that we've already seen. And this was the exchange between Whitaker and O'Neill, where David Whitaker texted, how much is the amount for Charlie? Charlie, of course, Charlie Irons, the manager of Yacht Haven Grand. O'Neill responds, $17,730. Charisse Amaro then asked Agent Whitworth, was Jenifer O'Neill aware that the lease deposit payment would come from the $70,000 of that inflated invoice? Dale Lionel Smith again objected here, and the judge told Charisse Amaro to rephrase her question. Charisse Amaro then rephrased by saying, based on your investigation, do you believe that Jenifer O'Neill was aware that this lease deposit payment would come from that inflated invoice? And Whitworth said, yes, based on his investigation, he did believe that she was aware. We then moved on to seeing the exhibit of that promissory note that was introduced. And this is something that, we've heard about. We heard that testimony from Jasmine Blyden yesterday that we believe was about this. So we saw this promissory note pulled up, and Agent Whitworth was asked to explain it. He said that the promissory note basically states that Ray Martinez borrowed this $11,500 and from David Whitaker, and then that those several installments of the $4,100 for tuition and rent and things like that. And that the promissory note said that these payments were just a loan and that Ray Martinez would pay David Whitaker back. Now, this document that we saw pulled up on the screen, it was signed by Ray Martinez, and the date next to that signature was August 15th of 2023. It's important to remember that date. As a side note, the attorneys for Ray Martinez were kind of objecting throughout a good amount of Charisse Amaro's questioning. And there were several times where she was just asked to rephrase certain questions. So then back to that promissory note, Agent Whitworth said that the promissory note was created after the cell phone of Ray Martinez was seized by the FBI. He said that Ray Martinez had discussions about creating this document and that they have recorded calls where Ray Martinez told David Whitaker he was going to a friend's house to draft it. Now, the friend, we believe, is Jasmine Blyden, this person who we heard testimony from, who said that Ray Martinez came over to her house and used her computer in June of 2023. Or excuse me, June of 2024. So then Charisse Amaro asked Agent Whitworth if the FBI knew when the document, this promissory note, was drafted. Whitworth said yes, it was drafted in June of 2024. But then Amaro asked, but what was the date on the document? And Whitworth said August 15th of 2023. He said that document was created 10 months after it was, claimed to be signed. Okay, so then we moved on to the cross-examination of Agent Whitworth by the attorney for Ray Martinez. And he asked Agent Whitworth about his training, about handling of sources. Agent Whitworth repeated this. We've already heard that. He also, and then the attorney said, wouldn't you say that a cooperating witness rarely is going to cooperate just out of the goodness of their heart? And Agent Whitworth said, believe it or not, actually, it does happen. And the attorney then said, but not in this case. The attorney, who, by the way, his name is Juan Matos de Juan, he asked Agent Whitworth if David Whitaker was expecting some kind of benefit, that his, that was his stated expectation for being a cooperating witness. Whitworth said yes, he believed Whitaker had said that. The attorney then asked, you said you recorded and monitored David Whitaker because you don't inherently trust him. And Agent Whitworth said that's correct. Then this is an interesting note I want to point out. There was some questioning about how Agent Whitworth first started looking into David Whitaker. And Agent Whitworth said, honestly, the first thing he did was just a Google search. And that Google search, every link that came up was about David Whitaker's criminal history. Just kind of going to the point of how easy it was to find this information. The attorney then asked, what crimes were in his criminal history. Whitworth said various fraud. And Whitworth said, there was not a lot of trust there between the FBI and David Whitaker. The attorney then asked if Ray Martinez went to Boston to hang out, or if Ray Martinez went to Boston to get treatments and get surgery for a brain tumor. Whitworth responded that he believed Ray Martinez did have medical appointments, but that they also did hang out, he said. He said the FBI had video surveillance and photos of David Whitaker and Ray Martinez in, the casino gambling and things like that. Then the attorney asked if these follow-up trips to Boston, though, weren't those for doctor's appointments also. And Agent Whitworth said he believed that Ray Martinez did have follow-up medical appointments. And the attorney said for a brain tumor, right? He wasn't just going for a hangnail. And Agent Whitworth said, correct. He did not go to Boston for a hangnail. So then there was a short break. And so the jury was excused. And during this break, there was a conversation with the judge and the attorneys. This is outside the presence of the jury. And this was because attorney Alex Dempsey for the United States said that the defense was attempting to introduce recordings that had not yet been heard in court between David Whitaker and Ray Martinez. The attorneys for Ray Martinez said, yes, there were 2 recordings from David Whitaker that the United States had actually provided in their discovery, and that these recordings were taken after that search warrant was executed on Ray Martinez's phone. In other words, these recordings were taken during the recordings that we heard of the kind of cover up of all of this. Alex Dempsey objected to these recordings coming in. He said it was an improper backdoor attempt to get them admitted. And if the United States wanted to introduce these recordings, or excuse me, if the defense wanted to introduce these recordings, they should have done it properly, and that the proper witness to introduce a recording between David Whitaker and Ray Martinez would have been David Whitaker or Ray Martinez, not Special Agent Kiernan Whitworth. The defense argued that these recordings were necessary because they gave a complete picture of the conversations that were heard in that time period. But what happened is the judge decided that they would rule on this, later on, and allow the attorney to finish his cross-examination of Agent Whitworth. Then the jury returned. Everyone was called back in, and Juan Matos de Juan asked Kiernan Whitworth if in August of 2023, before David Whitaker became a cooperating witness, he went to Boston. And wasn't it true that the FBI got in touch with their Boston FBI office and asked them to surveil David Whitaker? And Kiernan Whitworth said, yes, they did do that. Then the attorney started asking the FBI special agent about this permission that the FBI gives cooperating witnesses to conduct illegal activity. Whitworth said, yes, they did give David Whitaker permission to commit bribery specifically for the purposes of this investigation. A side note, you'll probably hear about this again. This agreement is called an OIA agreement. That stands for otherwise illegal activity. The attorney then asked if the FBI was concerned that David Whitaker would step outside the bounds of this otherwise illegal activity agreement. And the special agent said that, the FBI was always concerned, which was why they monitored and had discussions and gave guidelines on what the cooperating witnesses could and could not do. Then the attorney tried to ask, do you remember in November of 2023, you told David Whitaker, but at this point, Charisse Amaro objected, and there was kind of a back and forth that went on for a while between the prosecution and the defense attorneys and the judge about how the defense was allowed to phrase certain questions. So then when he went to ask questions again, Juan Matos de Juan asked, if David Whitaker stepped outside the bounds of his otherwise illegal activity agreement. Special Agent Whitworth said, as far as I'm aware, no, he didn't. The attorney then asked, were you aware of him being advised that he was coming close to stepping outside of that agreement? At which point Charisse Amaro objected again. The attorney then moved on to a different line of questioning, asked about Monethos providing services to the Virgin Islands Police Department. Whitworth said, yes, they did. And then the defense attorney asked if Monethos was doing these services well. And Agent Whitworth said he cannot speak to that. His investigation only related to the bribery, and the quality of Monethos' services, wasn't in the scope of his investigation. Then there was a discussion that the defense attorney tried to get into about the first time the FBI approached David Whitaker. And Agent Whitworth said that they first approached David Whitaker in September of 2023. We've heard this over and over again, and that it was to execute this search warrant. Juan Matos then asked, during this approach of David Whitaker, wasn't the FBI trying to make a show of authority? Didn't you show up with guns and bulletproof vests? Whitworth said, when I am on duty, my gun is always on me. Matos said, so you were establishing authority. And Agent Whitworth said, well, we want to make it clear, yes, we are law enforcement. And Juan Matos then said, and that rattles people, doesn't it? And the agent said, yes, he imagines it could. And then the attorney asked, and after, that, you then spoke to David Whitaker and that he made statements right after this. And Whitworth said, yes. Juan Matos then moved on to asking about before David Whitaker became a cooperating witness and before this bribery investigation had started, was David Whitaker approached by the FBI when they were just requesting from David Whitaker and Monethos, at this point just a government contractor, for a report on the listening devices that they found in government offices? Whitworth said, yes, the FBI did receive documentation from David Whitaker on those listening devices. And the attorney said, well, was it easy to get those documents from Whitaker, or did he initially refuse to turn all of that over? And Whitworth said that this was actually before his time as, a special agent on this case, but that he believed it was difficult to get things from Mr. Whitaker. We then had the defense attorneys bring up that promissory note again in their cross, and they were asking Whitaker if he had found any repayments for, the services that were discussed in this promissory note. And the special agent said, no, he hadn't found any repayments. But then the attorney pointed to a certain part of that promissory note that said, and asked the agent, when does this promissory note say that that repayment is supposed to start? And Agent Whitaker says the document states repayment will start 90 days after the restaurant opens. And then he was asked, when did the restaurant open? He said he believed it was this summer. And the attorney said, so the repayment period hasn't even started. Then the attorney moved on to asking the special agent about his understanding of how criminals typically use money and move payments. And he said, isn't it your experience that people illegally taking money try to hide those payments, that they don't want to leave a paper trail? Agent Whitworth said, yes, typically. Then Juan Matos asked, based on your experience, would someone trying to hide money leave a paper trail? Then Sharice Amaro objected to this. Juan Matos then tried to keep going on it by asking, these payments of, between Ray Martinez and David Whitaker, they're not consistent with how you've seen people trying to hide money, are they? And Whitaker said that hiding money happens in multiple ways. Just give me a chance to catch up on my notes. 1 second. Oh, then we moved on to Juan Matos de Juan asking the special agent about whether or not he ever asked David Whitaker to discuss expensive watches with Ray Martinez. The Sharice Amaro objected to this. And then Kiernan Whitworth, the special agent, just said that the FBI wants their cooperating witnesses to have natural interactions in, these circumstances. Then Juan Matos asked Whitworth, but based on your experience, your past experience with these kind of crimes, wouldn't you agree that politicians love the bling bling, the flashy stuff, is what he said. And Agent Whitworth said, they have their own things. He said that it could be a watch. And then he also said, but it could also be restaurant equipment. It could be a trip to Boston. What they like varies in his experience. Then the attorney asked again, did you instruct David Whitaker to bring up certain topics like watches? And Kiernan Whitworth said, he couldn't recall exactly. Then Juan Matos went and introduced a document that we did not see, but that was shown to the special agent to refresh his memory. And after viewing this, Juan Matos re-asked Agent Whitworth, was David Whitaker instructed to discuss fancy watches with Ray Martinez? And Agent Whitworth said, yes. He said that David Whitaker was told to do this because they were told that Ray Martinez liked and favored fancy watches by that David Whitaker had told the FBI this. But then Juan Matos asked if the FBI had seized any watches or if they had ever seen Ray Martinez with any fancy watches. And the special agent said, he couldn't really distinguish the fancy watches, nor did he recall, but that no, they did not seize any. So, an observation just from sitting in court during the cross examination of Agent Whitworth, Ray Martinez was, he was attentive. He appeared to be taking notes. He was looking up, but I could not fully see his face during all of this. Then the jury was excused and we took a break for lunch. And this was when the judge and the attorneys discussed again those recordings that the defense said that they were trying to introduce that we hadn't heard before. The judge said that he needed to hear these recordings in order to kind of make a decision. Alex Dempsey, the prosecutor for the US, objected to them being played in open court. So unfortunately, we didn't get to hear those recordings, but they did go back and listen to those with the judge to see if the judge would allow them. When we returned after lunch, the attorneys for Ray Martinez very quickly said that actually the defense had decided they would not be introducing those recordings. And this is Judge Mark Kearney, he kind of laughed and said, well, I guess we just learned a lot over the last 40 minutes, but okay. And we moved on. Then the jury entered, and now it was time for Dale Lionel Smith, the attorney for Jenifer O'Neill, to cross-examine Special Agent Whitworth. Smith asked if the investigation into listening devices being planted in government offices, if that kind of investigation was typical for the FBI to get involved in. And Whitworth said that in this scenario that we've been discussing, the FBI was actually asked to assist. Then, sorry, one moment. Let me just catch up here. Then Kiernan Whitworth there was a line of questioning about certain things and certain interactions with the FBI that David Whitaker had apparently had before Kiernan Whitworth was the special agent on the case. If you'll remember, we kind of talked about how Special Agent Whitworth said that before he was on the case, it was his understanding that the FBI had tried to get certain documents from Monethos and David Whitaker about these listening devices that Monethos had found, and that it was kind of difficult to get. And there was just a lot of questioning about a special agent that they called Special Agent Banga, who had been trying to get this documentation. And I can't really tell you what they were trying to get at, but that line of question didn't really go that far. Then Dale Lionel Smith started asking Special Agent Whitworth if in August of 2023, if the FBI had come to the conclusion that David Whitaker was, involved in, these conspiracies and these bribe schemes. Whitworth said yes, that the FBI had come to the conclusion that he was involved. Then Smith asked and clarified, but the FBI came to the conclusion that the conspiracy was between David Whitaker and Ray Martinez. And Whitworth said that, yeah, most of the evidence was related to Whitaker and Martinez and the fake devices, but that there was also peripheral evidence at this point about other transactions and other players. Then we saw a document we didn't see this. We heard about a document that Dale Lionel Smith talked a lot about. It was called a sensitive investigation matter document. And these have synopses about certain things that the FBI is dealing with. And he asked Agent Whitworth to review this document that was from August of 2023. And he asked Agent Whitworth if this document, if this talked about a conspiracy involving Jenifer O'Neill. And the special agent said no, the synopsis of this document at this time was about a conspiracy between Ray Martinez and David Whitaker, but that Jenifer O'Neill's name did come up a couple times in it. Then Dale Lionel Smith moved on from that and went to questioning about David Whitaker's background again. He asked if, excuse me, one moment. He said, He was asking about whether or not the FBI trusted David Whitaker. And Kiernan Whitworth said, for people who the FBI approaches who have committed criminal acts, no, we don't generally trust them. Then Smith asked, and did you know that David Whitaker had a criminal conviction as early as, and he either said 1997 or 1987. I didn't catch it. But either way, Charisse Amaro objected at this point, and the judge got involved. The judge looked at Dale Lionel Smith, and this is something that we observed a lot of yesterday, saying, that you can't do that. He admonished Smith, saying that it was a specific court order that he could not, bring up that those old convictions, and that he was violating that court order. And this was also just another kind of interesting observation from the courtroom, as there was all of this back and forth between Dale Lionel Smith and objections from the prosecution and the judge getting involved. You can almost hear when the prosecution is about to object to something Smith was saying, because the chairs that Alex Dempsey and Charisse Amaro are sitting in kind of squeak. So throughout, we could literally just hear a squeak forward and then an objection. And this was just an ongoing thing. Then Dale Lionel Smith started moving on to asking questions about statements that Whitaker made in proffer agreements. He asked if Whitaker had made statements to the FBI in those proffers that were not true. And Whitaker said he didn't recall any untrue statements being made by David Whitaker. Then Smith asked, did Whitworth have any any recollection of false statements about planting devices that Whitaker had made to the FBI in these proffer agreements? And Whitworth said, no, he did not recall any false statements. But he did say that sometimes it does take a while to get the full story and for all of that to come out in these proffer agreements. Smith then asked if there was a time that David Whitaker had to be admonished by the FBI because he went outside the scope of the investigation. And Whitworth said that there were circumstances where the FBI did admonish David Whitaker, but as to the specifics, he would need to, see documents to have his memory refreshed. Then Dale Lionel Smith's questioning continued. I'm not going to try to get into all of that, mainly just because his questioning, it would kind of ramble. It kind of multi-part questions again. At several points, Whitworth kind of said he was confused about what the question was. There were moments where I also didn't understand what these questions were. And the judge even kind of got involved and looked at Dale Lionel Smith and said, you need to do questions and answers, not speeches. We also heard Special Agent Whitworth say that when the FBI first approached David Whitaker, that Whitaker said he felt pressure to plant these listening devices in government offices, but not that he was told to plant them. Dale Lionel Smith then asked Whitworth if at some point David Whitaker came up with the idea, he said, isn't it true that at some point David Whitaker came up with the idea for Ray Martinez to give Jenifer O'Neill money? And Whitworth said that was not true. Smith said, or are you saying that you don't believe it to be true? And Whitworth said no, he had evidence to the contrary, that it was not David Whitaker who came up with the idea for Ray Martinez to give Jenifer O'Neill money. Smith then asked Whitworth if a cooperating witness was engaging in entrapment, wouldn't that be concerning to the FBI? And Whitworth said, of course it would be concerning. Then Smith went back to something he had been talking about yesterday, this idea of asking Special Agent Whitworth if David Whitaker ever used certain language, like fraudulently increase or fraudulently inflate or fraudulently add. And Special Agent Whitworth said no, the word fraudulently hadn't been used. And Smith said, so the takeaway from this is that you didn't hear the word fraudulently, correct? And Whitworth said, no, he did not hear the word fraudulently. The United States then did a redirect. Charisse Amaro came up and she asked the special agent, based on your experience, do criminals sometimes use code words? And Whitworth said, yes. And Charisse Amaro asked why. And he said that it was to hide what was truly going on. He said, for example, on a drug bust, they don't call cocaine cocaine, they call it fish or something. He said they don't call fraud fraud here, they call it inflating an invoice. Then Charisse Amaro also asked Whitworth about these recording devices that the FBI gave David Whitaker. And Whitworth explained that these recording devices that are given by the FBI, the only thing on them is an on and off button. And that the FBI can see when the recorder starts and when the recorder stops, when they download those recordings, basically just saying, this isn't something that can be tampered with. Then there was a recross quickly by the attorneys for Ray Martinez, and they asked Attorney Whitworth, on all 3 trips to Boston, didn't Ray Martinez visit a doctor? And Kiernan Whitworth said, yes, he believed he did. And then the attorney asked, and isn't it true that you can visit a doctor and have a steak and have a good steak on the same day? And Kiernan Whitworth said, hypothetically, that is possible. Now, I know that was a lot. This was a big witness for the United States, obviously, as the special agent. So it did take the majority of the day, but that was the end of Kiernan Whitworth's testimony. And then the United States called their next witness, and this was a woman named Jamie Gaston. I said her name earlier. She is a she's an employee for the Office of Management and Budget. Her title is, she is the Federal Grants Manager at OMB, and she oversees ARPA. ARPA is one of the grants that she oversees. And Alex Dempsey for the United States asked if it was her job to make sure that, invoices existed and that they were, paid from the ARPA funds. But he said, it isn't your job to ensure the validity of the invoices, is it? And Jamie Gaston said, correct, that wasn't part of her job. Then we saw this text message that I read earlier, get back on the screen. This was the text between Jamie Gaston and Jenifer O'Neill, where Jenifer O'Neill asks Miss Gaston to make sure that all of the pending ARPA payments are processed, so they make it on the Tuesday check run. Jamie Gaston said, yes, this was a text she received. And she also said that this was a text she received on a Saturday. Then Dale Lionel Smith for Jenifer O'Neill cross-examined. And he said, but when you get an invoice, doesn't it come from, when you get an invoice from Monethos, doesn't it come from VIPD? Or excuse me, let me just make sure I read this note I made right. Yes, so he asked, when you get an invoice, it comes from VIPD. And Jamie Gaston said, yes. And so Dale Lionel Smith then said, so the Virgin Islands Police Department would be the one doing the vetting. And Jamie Gaston said, yes. Then Smith asked, and Miss O'Neill never took an invoice and said, I'm going to push it through. But at this point, Alex Dempsey objected. Smith actually, apologized and said, my fault, I'll rephrase that. And Smith then asked, OMB doesn't make the ultimate decision on whether an invoice is paid. Isn't that correct? And Jamie Gaston said, correct. Then there was another back and forth between Dale Lionel Smith and the judge. Smith was trying to introduce a certain type of document. The judge was saying, he couldn't do it the way he was trying to do it, at which point Dale Lionel Smith said, okay, I'll use your approach. And then the judge looked at him and said, I appreciate that, but that's not my approach. That is the Supreme Court's approach. Just kind of highlighting a bit of the tension between Smith and the way he was going about things and how the judge was responding. Then there was some questioning about involvement of a company called Ernst & Young and how they got involved reviewing certain things at OMB. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but basically what Jamie Gaston said in this was that, yes, this company did review certain invoices for validity and all of that kind of thing, but that this auditing process they did was done after the invoices were processed and moved through and everything. Ernst & Young wasn't, involved in her job or those processes that she was moving through. Then Dale Lionel Smith did something kind of odd or interesting at this point. He kind of just stopped in the middle of questioning and said to Jamie Gaston, "By the way, you had just been promoted, hadn't you? I hope you were getting a lot more money." And this wasn't really a question. It was kind of odd. And Jamie Gaston didn't say anything. And then Dale Lionel Smith withdrew the question, at which point the judge looked at him and said, "Just ask questions. This is not speech time. Come on." Then the United States redirected quickly, and Alex Dempsey just asked Jamie Gaston, in January of 2024, was your role part of the process of invoices being paid? She said yes. And he said, so your role furthered the process of getting an invoice paid? She said yes. And then he asked, if there was any way she would have known an invoice was, a fraudulent invoice. She said no. And he said, was it your job to check for that? She said no. Then there was a short break, and we heard a quick conversation between the judge and the attorneys without the jury present, at which point both the attorneys for Ray Martinez and Jenifer O'Neill moved to dismiss the case under Rule 29. These are motions that the evidence presented is insufficient for the charges and that the United States has not met their burden of proof. This seems to be just kind of a procedural thing that happens. I would almost kind of attribute it as like a Hail Mary, if you will. And the judge just said, yes, those motions were noted, but we haven't heard a ruling on them. Then the jury re-entered the courtroom, and at this point, the United States rested their case. This means they aren't going to be calling any more witnesses. We've heard from all of the witnesses. We've seen all of the evidence that the prosecution is going to introduce. So it is now time for the defense to present their case and bring forth witnesses. So we went to the attorneys for Ray Martinez, and this was Miguel Oppenheimer this time, and they called their first witness to the stand. Now, this was Anthony Thomas. We've heard a lot about him throughout this case. And he walked into the room. He was wearing a blue suit, had kind of a confident walk up to the witness stand. He said that he is currently employed at WAPA, the Virgin Islands Water and Power Authority, as the chief administrative officer. He's been there since December of 2024, he said. But before WAPA, he worked at Monethos Pro Support. He began working in April of 2023, and he left in September of 2024, he said. Before that, he said he was the commissioner for the Department of Property and Procurement, that he began that role in January of 2019 and left that role in February of 2023. Then he was questioned about his role at Monethos. He said he was the vice president of strategic alliances and contracts while he was there, and that his job was really about finding jobs on the government database and writing proposals for them. He also testified that when he started working for Monethos was already working with the Virgin Islands Police Department doing investigations at this point. Then Miguel Oppenheimer asked him who requested the contract between Monethos and the Virgin Islands Police Department. And Anthony Thomas said the Commissioner of Property and Procurement. That was, Lisa Alejandro, who we heard testimony from. And then he went into explaining what we've already heard, that the commissioner asked or would ask for things like this because when a vendor continually is providing services for a government agency and a need is obviously being met, there needs to be a contract in place. It can't just be repeated invoices that are being paid through justification letters. There needs to be that contract between the parties. He was then asked how long it took to get that Monethos and VIPD contract. He said that he believed it started in May and then was finalized in October of 2023. And he was then asked if this was a normal timeline for something like that. And Anthony Thomas said, yes, it was. He was then asked if after that contract was signed, did he deal with invoice payments? And Anthony Thomas said, he wasn't involved in creating the invoices, but he would follow up with the Virgin Islands Police Department about those invoices getting paid. And he said, and then he was asked what frequency he would do this. And Anthony Thomas said usually David Whitaker would let him know that an invoice had been submitted to the police department. And at that point, he would begin following up. Oppenheimer then asked him if the payment process that he observed while he was working for Monethos, if this was slow or normal. And he said he thought it was normal. And then he was asked, but, what about compared to your experience as the commissioner at PNP? And Anthony Thomas just said that, the time period for these getting paid, that it all kind of depended on where the money was coming from. Then he was asked if these payments were being expedited within the Virgin Islands Police Department for Monethos. And Anthony Thomas said that he had no knowledge of what was happening inside VIPD. Then he was asked if anyone else other than himself from Monethos communicated with VIPD about invoices. And Anthony Thomas said David, referring to David Whitaker. He was then asked why he left Monethos, and Anthony Thomas said that he quit in September of 2024 after learning that Whitaker, had pled guilty to fraud. He said, quote, "That was the end for me." Then the United States did their cross-examination of Anthony Thomas, and he was asked if he was aware that David Whitaker had, this personal relationship with Ray Martinez while he was working at Monethos. And Thomas said, no, he did not. He was also asked, while you were at Monethos, did you know about invoices being inflated? At this point, Ray Martinez's attorneys objected, and Alex Dempsey, the prosecutor, rephrased. He asked if Anthony Thomas knew that if a line item had been added, would you submit that invoice? Like if it had been added fraudulently? And he said no. And when asked why, he said, because that's unethical. And then Alex Dempsey asked, and would you say it was criminal? And Anthony Thomas said yes. He was then asked if he knew about the fact that the original invoice that Monethos had submitted was lower than that second invoice that, was inflated. And he said no, he did not know about that original invoice being lower and the second one being higher. He was then asked if he ever submitted a fraudulent invoice while he worked at Monethos, and Anthony Thomas said no. And when asked if he would, Anthony Thomas said no. Then Miguel Oppenheimer did a quick redirect. He said to Anthony Thomas, "Did your duties involve creating invoices?" Thomas said no. He said, "Did your duties involve submitting invoices?" Anthony Thomas said no. And then Alex Dempsey was allowed to ask one more question, and he asked, so you did not submit invoices, but you would sometimes follow up on invoices? And Anthony Thomas said yes. Jenifer O'Neill's attorney did not cross-examine Anthony Thomas, and this was the end of his testimony. He was really finished quite quickly. He was finished, between 10 and 15 minutes. Then the defense went on and called their next witness, and this was Ludwig Thomas. He said he was a police sergeant with the Virgin Islands Police Department. He said he had worked for VIPD for 35 years, and that he was also currently the special assistant to the current police commissioner, that's Mario Brooks, since July of 2025. And he also said that he was the special assistant under Ray Martinez when Ray Martinez was commissioner. He was then asked by Miguel Oppenheimer what his duties were as special assistant, and he explained that, his daily work was just working alongside the commissioners on a series of matters pertaining to the department. He was asked how long he knew Ray Martinez. He said he had known him for a number of years. And he also, in talking about his duties as a special assistant under Ray Martinez, said that he would typically spend all day, every day with Ray Martinez when Ray Martinez was on St. Thomas as commissioner. Now, an observation, while Ludwig Thomas was testifying, I did see Ray Martinez writing a note and then passing it to his other attorney who was seated with him while Miguel Oppenheimer was doing this questioning up at that stand. Then Miguel Oppenheimer asked if Ludwig Thomas knew David Whitaker, and he said yes. He knew that he was doing work for VIPD with his company Mon Ethos. And then he was asked what kind of relationship he had with David Whitaker and with Mon Ethos. And Ludwig Thomas said that it was, a department to vendor typical relationship, nothing outside of that. Then there was a little bit of questioning about the services that Mon Ethos provided. Alex Dempsey was objecting to this, but then at one point, Ludwig Thomas did say, I think their services were superb. Alex Dempsey objected, but that was already something Thomas had said. Then Miguel Oppenheimer moved on to asking questions about meetings that Ludwig Thomas had maybe attended with David Whitaker. And Ludwig Thomas said, yes, he had attended certain meetings with David Whitaker and Ray Martinez, that they were at Whitaker's office or at the VIPD office, and that the meetings were always about work that Mon Ethos was doing with the Virgin Islands Police Department. He was then asked if he got phone calls from David Whitaker. And Ludwig Thomas said, yes, he did receive certain phone calls and that he got them maybe a couple times a week sometimes. That was his guess. And he said these conversations and the calls were always relative to invoices being paid or checks being received by Mon Ethos. Then Miguel Oppenheimer also asked if Ludwig Thomas was ever contacted by anyone else at Mon Ethos other than David Whitaker about these invoices. And he said, yes, he was contacted by Anthony Thomas. And when asked how frequently, he just said quite a bit. Then he was asked about who had access to Ray Martinez's email. And Ludwig Thomas said that he did. He had full access to Ray Martinez's email because there was such a high influx of emails that it was his job to kind of go through and figure out what was urgent to discuss with Ray Martinez. And then he was asked if, in doing that, if he saw emails from Anthony Thomas and David Whitaker. And Ludwig Thomas said, yes, he did. Miguel Oppenheimer then also asked if David Whitaker had contacted Ray Martinez while he was the special agent for Ray Martinez. And Ludwig Thomas said, yes, David Whitaker contacted Ray Martinez quite often, and that these types of conversations they had were professional conversations. Then he was asked about Ray Martinez's restaurant. He said, yes, he was aware that Ray Martinez was building a restaurant while he was the commissioner for VIPD. And when Miguel Oppenheimer asked him how often Ray Martinez visited that restaurant during working hours, Ludwig Thomas said he hardly ever did. He said that the contractors were always at the restaurant and that Ray Martinez was very busy with VIPD matters. Then Oppenheimer asked how Ludwig Thomas would characterize Ray Martinez. What was his style as a police commissioner? And Ludwig Thomas said that Ray Martinez was very hands-on, that he always wanted to be on the scene of, crimes, that he would offer suggestions and give directions. He said Ray Martinez led from the front. And when asked if Ray Martinez spent more time out of the office or in the office, Ludwig Thomas says, it was a little bit of both. He knew that Ray Martinez wanted to be out there, but out there meaning, outside of the office, but that he also had to take care of administrative work. And when asked if he was, always up to date on his administrative work, Ludwig Thomas said, yes, Ray Martinez was. Then the United States did their cross-examination of Ludwig Thomas, and they asked him if he attended a birthday party at Ray Martinez's house in 2023. Now, side note for anyone who's been following, you may remember when I told you about certain call recordings, and there was one call recording between Ray Martinez and David Whitaker, where it was Ray Martinez's birthday. Ray Martinez was saying, he had drank a lot of tequila and that a bunch of people were over celebrating his birthday, and that he had been grilling steaks for them on this grill that the United States says David Whitaker purchased for him as a bribe. Okay, anyway, back to Ludwig Thomas's testimony. So Alex Dempsey asked if he had attended that birthday party, and Ludwig Thomas said yes, he had. Then he was asked if he recalled this Kamado grill, that's the brand. And Thomas said he didn't recall the name of the grill. But then he was asked, but was there a grill? Ludwig Thomas said yes. Then the prosecution said, and if I showed you a photo of the grill, would you be able to identify it and say that was, the grill that was there that night? And Ludwig Thomas said he didn't think he would be able to do so. And when asked why, he said that, he wasn't paying that close of attention to the grill at the party. Alex Dempsey then also asked him if he was present at an April meeting at Monethos's offices between Jenifer O'Neill, Ray Martinez, and David Whitaker. And Ludwig Thomas said he could not recall. Now, Alex Dempsey then did ask him about the trips to Boston and if he was aware that Ray Martinez had traveled to Boston. Ludwig Thomas said, yes, he was aware that it had to do with, these medical appointments. But then Alex Dempsey also asked, but not all three of those, trips he had surgery, correct? And Ludwig Thomas said, he wasn't sure exactly of when the surgery happened. Then Alex Dempsey said, and were you aware that Ray Martinez attended a Celtics game? And he said he was not. He said, were you aware if he attended a Red Sox game? Ludwig Thomas says he does not know. Then Alex Dempsey asked, and were you aware of this $1,000 meal? And Thomas said, no, he was not. He said, were you aware they gambled? And Thomas said, no, he did not. Now, this was the end of Ludwig Thomas's testimony. And so at this point, Ray Martinez, the attorneys rested their case. So now the United States has rested, Ray Martinez has rested, and we've moved on to Jenifer O'Neill being able to present her case. However, Dale Lionel Smith did not call any witnesses or present any additional evidence, and he just rested his case right there. So at this point, the judge looked at the jury and said, okay, everyone, the book is closed. The case, all three, the prosecution and both defendants have rested their case. And he said there's no more evidence that's going to be introduced, that the case would be in their hands for deliberation tomorrow. At this point, the jury was dismissed, and it was kind of a quick or maybe abrupt ending to the day. But once the jury was dismissed, the judge did get into some more things very quickly with the defendants. And this is the first time that we heard either Ray Martinez or Jenifer O'Neill speak at trial. The judge asked, or the judge told both of them that they had the right to testify or not testify on behalf of their defense at the trial. And he asked if they had both had the opportunity to speak with their attorneys about this and come to a decision. Ray Martinez said yes, he had spoken to his attorneys about this, but he said he would like more time before he made the decision of whether to testify. Jenifer O'Neill was asked those same questions, and she said she had made the decision not to testify. So at this point, the judge said that Ray Martinez has the evening to basically speak with his lawyers and make that decision if he is going to testify or not. The judge also made a point to tell Ray Martinez that this was his decision, Ray Martinez's decision, that he could get advice from counsel, but ultimately it wasn't counsel's decision whether he would testify. It was completely up to him. And Ray Martinez looked at the judge and said he understood that. So where we stand right now is that a lot is going to be determined based on whether or not we find out if Ray Martinez is going to testify. And we'll find that out tomorrow morning. If Ray Martinez does testify, we'll go in a whole different direction. The case will go on a bit longer. However, if he chooses not to testify, what's going to happen is the judge and the attorneys are going to get into deliberations over the instructions for the jury. They plan on spending all morning on this. And then the jury has been told to report for noon tomorrow, at which point we will hear closing arguments. And after closing arguments, it is now in the jury's hands and it goes to deliberation. But where we leave off today, we are going to be back in court early tomorrow morning to find out whether or not Ray Martinez will be providing testimony in this case. And I will be back here tomorrow evening to give you another update on all of this. My name, once again, is Isabelle Teare. This is Trial Watch. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you will do so tomorrow. Have a good evening.